All right, so welcome to the 185th session of the AI Safety Reading Group. We'll be discussing parts 3 and 4 of If I Were a Well-Intentioned AI. So, last time we saw that Goodhart's law is not quite a law. Goodharting is only a problem for values with certain properties, and the AI is unaware of those properties. Because human values tend to have most of these properties, we fear Goodhart-like behavior. So a non-exhaustive list is on the screen. Don't worry if you don't read it all. A well-intentioned AI should query the human whether these conditions are relevant. In some cases, this can entirely remove the perverse behavior. So we've seen that for regressional Goodharting and some extremal Goodharting, we can do away with this by, say, stating that the returns are rapidly diminishing. This is quite easily solved because you can just implement that in the code, or the AI can just mess around with that fairly easily. Some other properties that are harder to deal with, like the true value function, the true human reward being very greatly penalized in probability, is harder to deal with in a useful general way. That is, as of now, an open problem. So, moving on to a summary of part 3. Stewart notes an approach to extremal Goodharting to avoid the issue of pushing the world into an extreme state when solving a problem. AIU should act in a way that is similar to a human. One common method would be to copy a human policy. This is low risk and low reward. You just get peak human performance. Stewart proposes acting in a way with the same statistical properties as a human policy. This means, for example, that there's no supersonic rocket launcher for a basketball game, but you don't have to limit yourself to a mechanical copy of a human arm. It's still restrictive, and choosing which properties to mimic is hard, but it leaves room for superhuman performance. As an example, say AIU is meant to treat cancer. You're given a reward for the number of cancer cells eliminated. The humans demonstrate a way to treat cancer by cutting them out with a scalpel. There's a few ways you could do this. Apprenticeship learning, as we've noticed before, is quite safe from extremal Goodharting because you're just copying exactly what a human does. And we don't seem to push the world into extreme states. Our morality is well adjusted for surgery. But there's obviously other ways to do this, ways that might be more efficient according to the value function you were given. Laser surgery might work well, but it's not very well tested for cancer. At least I assume not. Acid can also work as a way to destroy cancer cells, but in a very different way to how lasers or scalpels might do it. We noticed before that a well-intentioned AI is probably capable enough and motivated enough to come up with various categories for solutions to a problem. So it should be able to notice the sheer difference of the approaches. Since it's so different to a human approach, surely the way humans have demonstrated how to solve this problem contains some information on their preferences as well. It should tell us exactly why pouring acid on, well, shoving a human into acid is not a good way to treat cancer. Now, you might recall that, well, I skipped ahead a bit earlier. Another justification for why you don't want to do the Apprenticeship learning way of doing things is that the humans provided you with a utility function for removing cancer cells. Why would they bother to do that if apprenticeship learning was good enough? They could have just solved that using supervised learning, which is fairly well known. So clearly they want you to do something better than surgery. So taking the different approach, you might recall that humans have defined extensional and intentional definitions. Intentional definitions are a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be of that type. For a chair, you might try a nearly flat surface supported in a stable position by one or more legs. This may work well within a certain context, but tends to be brittle. For example, is a Persian stool a chair? And I would say, yeah, it probably is. This brings us to the second kind of definition, which seems quite common amongst human concepts. Extensional definitions are a set of examples. Say you have 10,000 images of a chair. Since this is just a list of examples, it's clear it can correlate with other extensional definitions. For example, a list of furniture will contain a great deal of chairs. All of the different correlations that a definition has with other concepts make up a web of connotations, as Stewart calls it. So AIU might reason, if I look at the web of connotations surgery has and act in a way that preserves that, I should avoid reaching extreme cases where the proxy fails me. Stewart agrees with this, as it seems like he came up with the idea. He argues that using this data to extrapolate should make AI judgments closer to what a human would make. This counts both for technological judgments, say, and moral judgments. Compare, say, a utilitarian and a virtue ethicist. Some utilitarians might view exterminating life as plausibly moral. Sorry, animal life as plausibly moral. Me, in case you're wondering who might have advocate that. Those kinds of people fall into the intentional moral theorists, I guess you could say. On the other hand, someone like a virtue ethicist or a natural law advocate would be sharply against that, and a lot of it would be due to that simply not being the kind of behavior that a human considers moral. It's just not correlated with all of the ideas we have what good is. And they seem to have a point. It's why I don't actually advocate eliminating all animal life. Um, as Stuart comments, this way of restricting the space of actions is like an impact measure. Of course, if we make it too restrictive, we're back at apprenticeship learning. As a side note, this idea is somewhat like that of quantizers that Miri introduced, in that we rank actions according to some distribution, in this case, how close their web of connotations are to that of surgery, and choose some top percentile. P quantizers rank actions by utility, assign them some weight according to how likely humans are to do them, and choose the top P%, hence the name, to avoid Goodhart-like behavior. Because this ranking seems kind of arbitrary, as in you just choose the top 1% or the top 2%, it seems a little inferior to Stewart's web of connotations, which is built up in terms of meaningful correlations. It should, in principle, be easier for the AI and humans to calibrate. Now, AIU realizes that some of these correlations are unnecessary to human value in terms of treating cancer, like blinking whilst operating, filling out forms, dying horribly 1% of the time, that sort of thing. Some are quite vital: long life expectancy, good quality life years, that smell hospitals have. You could try asking humans which they care about and which they don't. Then you optimize for the ones they claim they care about, for example, not being in pain, until their web of connotations reaches the acceptable bounds. This should avoid problems like flooding everyone with morphine forever, as that is very poorly correlated with, for example, human satisfaction. But a lack of pain is moderately correlated with human satisfaction. So that fails the test of retaining the web of connotations. Querying the human about what they want to keep is not such a difficult task. For example, for some relatively simple features, there is a paper called Active Inverse Reward Design, which shows that you can set up a reward learning agent that can get some rather impressive results with a few questions about what a human really cares about. This greatly aids building up a picture of the true utility function. Now, that paper sort of presupposes meaningful correlations, meaningful questions the AI can ask you. As AIU may have concepts that are incredibly difficult for a human to understand but have very important correlations, this could be a problem. Of course, as the AI becomes more and more intelligent, it is more and more of a problem. Some RL papers investigate analogous problems with promising results. They trained an agent to navigate some complex world. This is Agent 1. Given a sub-goal, it will manage to figure out how to navigate through this environment to reach that goal in a set amount of time. Then you train a simplified representation of the world to give another AI, which has not got the abilities to navigate through the world directly. This one plans the long-term trajectory, so it chooses the sub-goals to achieve some final goal and tells the first AI to follow those sub-goals. Perhaps AIU could learn to simplify features in a similar manner to give to the human and allow them to choose which features are relevant. Now, that could be quite a difficult task, but hopefully, given enough knowledge of human thoughts, you might be able to do that. Note that this idea of this web of connotations is quite separate to having a well-intentioned AI. A well-intentioned AI, for example, will actively try and seek out information about the true value function. And without a well-intentioned AI, this proposal has some serious consequences. Just examining it on its own merits for a moment, we might say that on the pro side, it's more meaningful than other approaches to limiting impact. As much of human knowledge is extensional, we should expect that the AI should be able to preserve a great deal of the features we care about. Furthermore, the sheer amount of information could also aid in extrapolating to new scenarios. Requesting queries and simplification of features both exist at a level where they might be useful in the approach to AGI. To see whether it generalizes for superhuman performance, we might apply these sorts of techniques to some superhuman AI in a very narrow domain, like, say, AlphaZero. Perhaps someone could construct features of games they find beautiful and let AlphaZero query them to see whether or not we can get a superhuman AI to successfully ask about relevant features for humans. We could try and get it to construct features for humans. That might be an interesting research project, but that's beyond the scope of the article. On the con side, this approach is incredibly costly. Of course, this depends on just how much information you keep. For example, if you just keep the correlation coefficient between, say, pain and a happy life, you might say that's, a correlation of 0.4. And then you just have some set of numbers that you have to keep. This grows geometrically, well, combinatorially, admittedly, but hopefully you don't have to go too far out in the web of connotations to get a decent impact measure. But why not keep the full distribution, the full correlations between one kind of action and the results? For example, you don't just have surgery being correlated with the pain. You can get a full distribution saying X% of people feel this much pain when you perform the surgery this way. Y not percent of people feel this much pain when you perform the distribution another way, etc. You can essentially keep a full probability distribution. This is far more costly, but in a sense, it keeps much more of the meaningful information. Now, the question is, isn't the point where you decide I should only keep so much of the distribution, like just the correlation coefficients, kind of arbitrary? Isn't that one of the reasons Stewart advocates this over something like a P quantizer? Now, there's a furthermore, there's a problem called seduction. Essentially, when the AI is explaining the sets of features that correlate with a certain action, and the AI thinks that one feature is very correlated with what the humans want, it might paint a very compelling picture for this and convince the human that, yeah, actually, I do want this, even though if they were given sufficient time, they would choose not to follow this path. In other words, the AI is effectively changing the human's values in order to make things slightly easier for itself. This is obviously problematic. You could try and counter this using sufficiently conservative AI, but that doesn't seem like a full solution. Another way would be to go back to the distribution idea and to just say, we'll keep all of it. That makes things far more robust, and I suspect much, much harder to satisfy all of those constraints at the same time. So the AI is greatly limited in the actions it can take. Of course, either you get back to apprenticeship learning, or it may be possible that the AI can somehow seduce you anyway, even whilst keeping the full web of connotations. I find this unlikely. Scott seems to find this unlikely as well. In his article on There Are No Indescribable Hell Worlds, he seems to be advocating a similar view. Now, there's another issue. I'm quite pessimistic about the consistency of human preferences. We seem to constantly make choices of one value over another, where previously we were undecided. And it seems like this is quite contingent on our circumstances. It depends on where we were, what we were doing, who we were speaking to, when this occurs, etc. The AI would have a lot of options in how to go about resolving these various contradictions. We might say pick a particular agenda, like Scott's proposed methodology for solving the problems of contradictory preferences. He seems to believe there was only a 10% chance of his agenda working out, but even if it does, why his agenda in particular? This is still, in a sense, an arbitrary choice. There are serious moral problems that we need to consider before applying a technique like this. Then again, that's true of the rest of AI safety. Finally, the second to last problem is that suppose the AI consults us, then I'm quite confident no, sorry, got that wrong. Communication. It's quite hard to get a guarantee that the AI will explain issues in a way that we really understand. OpenAI presented debate as a way to do this, but that kind of presupposes that we can control the AI in the first place, and there's a few of them with different sets of values trying to argue for which solution is optimal to the human. Scott's attempted to create a method to solve this sort of thing, but he's still unsure about a key part of the solution. Now, this section is a bit more fair bit more speculative, but depending on the complexity of the web of connotations, we might end up creating a MESA optimizer. It may even be necessary. Perhaps the AI finds that the optimal solution is some better set of institutions that will optimize medical science. Now, we'll get into what a MESA optimizer is in a moment, but a well-intentioned AI could probably solve about half of these problems or more if it weren't a superintelligence. Superintelligence seems to make everything harder after all. Now let's move on to the next section, which is part 4. Now, suppose that you are a MESA optimizer that's also an agent. If you are controlled, you can look quite different to if you were an aligned optimizer. If you're aligned, you can look quite different to an unaligned optimizer. A well-intentioned AI has some bias towards being controlled because the humans have, after all, attempted to control it. We'll get into this more in a moment. Now, what's a MESA optimizer? In this case, suppose that AIU has been produced by some optimization process, like, I don't know, gradient descent, but that's unlikely. And you have your own goals to pursue that you will optimize for. An explicit example is evolution, which is an optimization process, producing humans which actively optimize for their own values. They compare and contrast different possible futures. They create possible utilities. They might have rank preferences and etc. They actually optimize for things. That is what is known as being a MESA optimizer. Well, in this case, you're a MESA optimizer as well as an agent. A MESA optimizer doesn't have to be an agent. Now, contrast this to the case of, for example, machine learning, where you might create a lookup table in your attempt to minimize some loss function. The lookup table is not performing any optimization. It's just if-else clauses. So in that case, it's not a MESA optimizer. MESA optimizers aren't very common at the moment. But anyway, you are a MESA optimizer in this situation. Now, let's take a concrete example. Suppose that you are within a company. The company has its own reward function, its own values. Perhaps this is determined by the investors. The company then strives to create agents that will be useful in solving for its values. In this case, we assume that you are made to meet some quota, and you also happen to be a MESA optimizer. So the scenario goes like this. In scenario 1, if you spend 90% of your budget, then, I should explain a bit more. The company has some policies that say that if you spend 90% of your budget in meeting the quota, the next year, you will only get 90% of the budget. If you meet 100% of the budget and meet the quota, the next year you'll get 100% of the budget. If you meet the quota at 110% of the budget, then your bosses will reprimand you. And if you do it too many times, you will be fired or deleted. Yes, you're an AI. But in this case, they'll still give you 100% of the budget next year. Stewart considers what happens in 3 different scenarios where you meet the quota under budget, and next year you still think that you're going to be able to meet the quota under budget. Scenario 2, you meet the quota under budget, but next year you expect you'll need 100% of the budget. Scenario 3, you meet the quota on budget this year, but you also suspect that your bosses would like a surplus this year if they had the information you had. Now, those are the 3 scenarios, S1, S2, S3. There's 3 different cases where you could be an aligned MESA optimizer, a controlled MESA optimizer, or both, with very different outcomes. Notice that the aligned optimizer says that in situation 3, you should overspend. Controlled optimizer says that you should do nothing in scenario 3. You shouldn't you shouldn't overspend. This seems a little odd, and well, according to Scott, this is a bit surprising, and this is similar, in fact, to what an unaligned optimizer would do. It would probably try and overspend, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's deal with control. Controlled agent is safely interruptible and corrigable. And corrigability is about doing what the human wants and keeping them in control. These ideas are poorly defined at the moment, but let's just try and go with what our intuitive understanding of these might be. So say that AIU is controlled. There is some procedure that the company may use when making you in order to ensure that you are happy to be interrupted in your day-to-day scenarios, even if it contradicts your utility function. And you also want to inform your controllers about what's going on, why you want to do an action, etc. Stewart writes this as saying that your utility is the base utility you have called the MESA utility, which is whatever you've been given by your creators, and the control utility. Your utility goes up if either of those goes up. So say if you're acting in a controlled way, you'll get some utility. If you're acting according to your base utility function, you'll get some utility. But naturally, there's some tension between them. And whichever wins depends on the design. But notice that the AI doesn't care at all about its creators' values in and of themselves. AIU, being well-intentioned, would try to take the control structure as info and avoid good hardening. But what's interesting is that in this case, by creating a control function and putting a tension in there, it seems like you're having some negative trade-offs. And in that case, we would expect that good hardening behavior is a problem. Last time we saw that negative trade-offs are one of the things where it seems like good hardening behavior becomes problematic. So we'll move on to alignment, the aligned agent, and see how it differs. So, sorry, I didn't actually cover what you would do. So, controlled agent, in the case of meeting the quota under budget and continuing to do so afterwards, it would be fine with that. It's meeting its base objective, which is just to meet the quota on budget, and it doesn't really care much about what happens next year. If it thinks that it's still going to be able to meet budget at meet the quota at 90% of the budget. Depending on its design, it may or may not do nothing in scenario 2. Scenario 2, recall, was that you meet the quota under budget, but next year you expect you'll require the whole budget. In that case, if you meet the quota under budget, then next year the company will give you a reduced budget. If you were completely uncontrolled, you would freak out because you want to meet the quota, and you would say, okay, I'm going to waste money. But since you're controlled, there's some tension there. Depending on your design, you might not decide to waste money. In the third scenario, where you meet the quota on budget, but suspect bosses would want surplus this year, that is, you should overspend this year, you do nothing. You don't really care about the fact that the bosses might value having more money this year. Of course, you might try informing the bosses about your difficulties in the second situation and the fact that they might want to overspend this year. You definitely would like to do that if you're a well-intentioned AI, but there's nothing that really guarantees you have to do that. But still, in the situation where you have the option of informing your bosses, as you are controlled, you will take that option since you are corrigable. Let's see how aligned MESA optimizers differ. According to Scott, the actions of a smart aligned MESA optimizer looks like a dangerous unaligned MESA optimizer defecting. Consider this, that when an AI is highly incompetent and it's aligned, it is likely going to trust its creators to have a better understanding of what it should do. In this case, it would try and follow the boss's orders. If they say that you need to meet the budget and that's all you need to worry about, the aligned AI might say, okay, I'll try and do that. And that would act similarly to a controlled AI. As the AI becomes more and more competent, more and more powerful, more and more intelligent, it would overspend in some of the situations. In the third situation here, the aligned AI would overspend because it values the surplus value that the bosses could get. And it knows that the bosses would value it if they understood that. So naturally, it would overspend. In the second scenario, it would waste the budget because, again, it values next year being on budget. And it knows the bosses would also value that. So it must waste 10% and use the whole budget in order not to get a reduced budget next year. But an unaligned AI could do a similar thing. It could just waste the budget in scenario 2 and try and come up with some clever sounding lie saying that, oh, it's because I expected next year that I would need 100% of the budget, and it might overspend and say, oh yes, it's because it was super valuable this year for you guys to have me exceed the quota. The bosses are therefore mistrustful of an aligned AI who acts like that because it's hard to distinguish them from an unaligned one. This is especially true when the AI is super intelligent, because how on earth can you tell if a super intelligence is lying to you or not? But if you were well-intentioned, AIU would treat the control as information about the true utility. You would say, okay, fine, maybe I should make a bit of a trade-off between what I think the boss's true values are and being controllable, because the bosses are clearly worried about this. There's some degree of uncertainty. And I am very cautious about any good-hearting effects, pushing the company into a very strange scenario or what have you. So I'll make some concessions and act a little controlled. This might continue on even until the AI is quite powerful. You need to be extra careful when balancing these value functions, and so is the management. So again, that's another reason for why you should act like a controlled AI, because otherwise power might be taken away from you. Now, Scott doesn't seem to have much more to say on this sort of good-hearting behavior, this sort of external good-hearting. So,
may I ask a question?
Yes.
You've made several references to Scott, but somewhere along the line I've missed out on who.
I'm really sorry. I'm terrible with names. I meant Stuart.
Okay.
Stuart. Okay. Stuart Armstrong, the guy who wrote this article. I'm very sorry about that. It's a bit embarrassing. So anyway, Stewart doesn't mention much more detail about what to do with a well-aligned AI. I'll just note that transferring complex information to humans is not solved, but again, a well-intentioned AGI should be able to handle that, as we discussed in part 3. For superintelligences, once more, we may expect aligned agents can explain their actions more easily via debates, but this presupposes AI with different values we can control. Again, for a well-intentioned AI, this isn't much of a problem. A slight hypothetical, what about non-agent MESA optimizers? Can they even be well-intentioned? Could, even assuming we can make well-intentioned AIs apply here in all cases? That would be an interesting scenario, but I have no intuition on whether or not it's true. And that's the series. If I had to make some slight appendix, I would say that Alex Turchin has proposed an idea called taking the outside view and working with that idea to its logical conclusions as a sort, well, not as an alternative, but it's clearly an alternative to talking about an AI that understands Goodharting-like behavior. In fact, I think that taking the outside view is a bit stronger of an assumption, because it seems like Goodhart's law is just noting that from the outside, you should expect that creating a proxy goal isn't going to work out well for you. So in this sense, Alex Turchin's results, if he does analyze them further, might supersede Scott's, but they're talking about a system that's harder to develop. And that's all I have to say. I have some more slides on MESA optimizers and some other stuff in case you guys are a bit confused, but that's it.